The diary pages trembled in his hands. My words, my secrets, my life. Dr. Vance's voice dripped with cold precision as he recited my deepest fears. I lunged, but Mark's grip locked around my wrist. My boyfriend, his real job to keep me in the dark. The brass lamp cracked against his skull, blood splattering the floor. Now I'm running, clutching a stolen flash drive, knowing every person I trusted was just another paycheck in Vance's experiment. And the worst part? I don't even know what's real anymore. The flash drive burns in my palm. One wrong move, and he erases me completely. The scent of antiseptic and stale rain clung to the hallway as Sarah pushed through her front door. The lock groaned, a familiar, rusted protest. But the silence inside felt heavy, like wet wool. Dr. Julian Vance sat in her velvet armchair, his spine a rigid line against the emerald fabric. Between his manicured fingers, he balanced a tattered notebook. The cardboard cover, once bright yellow and covered in glitter stickers, now bore the gray grime of decades. Sarah's keys hit the floor with a metallic ring. Julian didn't flinch. He traced the jagged edge of a sticker, a half-peeled sun. You wrote about the red bicycle for 3 pages, Sarah. June 1994. His voice carried the dry texture of parchment. The fear of falling outweighed the desire for speed. We noted the hesitation. It became a baseline for your adult risk assessment. A cold sweat prickled Sarah's scalp. She reached for the doorframe, her fingers digging into the chipped paint. That diary belonged in a taped box in her mother's attic, 3 states away. My mother gave you that? The words scraped her throat. Julian turned a page, the paper whispering. Your mother was a paid observer, Sarah, as was your first husband. Every heartbreak, every career shift, every morning coffee. It's all archived. You aren't a woman living a life. You are a data set we've curated since your first breath. He looked up, his eyes 2 glass marbles reflecting her trembling shadow. He offered a small, clinical smile. The experiment enters its final phase today. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs, replaced by a vacuum that made her ears pop. She stared at the diary, seeing not just a book, but the physical evidence of a theft. Every scraped knee, every secret crush on a boy in the 3rd grade, every tear shed into a pillow. It wasn't hers. It was a line on a chart, a variable in a laboratory she hadn't known she lived in. The room seemed to tilt, the familiar beige walls of her Virginia apartment suddenly feeling like the plastic panels of a dollhouse. You're lying, she whispered, though the clinical precision of his gaze told her otherwise. Data doesn't lie, Sarah. It only reveals. Vance stood up, his suit jacket remaining perfectly smooth, a testament to its expensive tailoring. He held the journal out, not to return it, but as an exhibit. Your reaction to this revelation was predicted with an 88% confidence interval. You're currently experiencing stage 1, denial. Soon, you'll move to stage 2. You'll try to reclaim your agency. It will be fascinating to watch. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the man she had called Professor for 3 years. The mentor who had guided her through her psychology degree. He wasn't a teacher. He was a zookeeper. Subverted. Sarah's mind, trained in the very logic Vance had taught her, began to fire with a desperate tactical heat. She needed that journal. It was the only tether to a version of herself that wasn't a subject. If she could get it back, she could find the names, the dates, the proof of who had been paid to love her. She calculated the distance between her boots and the chair. Vance was older, his movements stiff and rehearsed. She lunged. Her fingers brushed the rough cardboard of the cover, a surge of triumph electric in her veins. She had him. She was faster, younger, and fueled by a righteous, burning fury that no data set could fully quantify. Her grip tightened on the spine of the diary. "Got it," she hissed, a small victory cry escaping her throat. But the diary didn't move. A hand, thick and heavy as a slab of meat, clamped down on her wrist. The pressure was immediate and agonizing, grinding the delicate bones of her arm together. Sarah gasped, her knees buckling as she was wrenched backward. She expected a stranger, a burglar, one of Vance's security goons. Instead, she looked up into the face of Mark Davis. Mark, who had brought her soup when she had the flu. Mark, who she had shared a bed with for 14 months. Mark, who had promised her, just last Tuesday, that they would look at engagement rings after finals. He didn't look like her boyfriend. He looked like a machine. His eyes, usually a warm hazel, were flat and vacant, focusing on a point just above her head. He didn't let go. He twisted her arm upward, pinning her against the wall with the practiced efficiency of a riot cop. The drywall crunched behind her head. "Mark?" The name was a broken plea. "Mark, what are you doing? Help me." "Subject is resisting," Mark said, his voice a low, monotone drone. He didn't look at her. He looked at Vance. "Should I apply a sedative, doctor?" The betrayal hit Sarah harder than the impact with the wall. The world shifted. The man who had whispered he loved her in the dark was currently checking his watch, tapping the glass 4 times with his free hand. A nervous habit she'd always thought was a cute athletic quirk. Now she realized it was a timing mechanism. He wasn't her partner. He was her monitor. He was the one who had been recording her heartbeat, her sleep cycles, her most intimate moments, and feeding them back to the man in the emerald chair. "No sedative yet, Mark," Vance said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I want to see the transition to stage 3. The realization of total isolation is a powerful catalyst for the final phase." Sarah struggled, her boots scuffing the floor, but Mark's weight was an anchor. He held her with a terrifying clinical indifference. She wasn't his girlfriend. She was a task, a job, a variable that needed to be suppressed. The apartment she had called home for 2 years felt like a cage, and the man she loved was the lock. "How much?" Sarah spat, the taste of copper in her mouth. "How much did he pay you to touch me? To lie to me?" Mark finally looked at her, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of the man she knew flickered in his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as a match blown out in a gale. "The contract was for 5 years, Sarah," he whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth she remembered. "I'm just a professional. Don't make this more difficult than it has to be." He increased the pressure on her wrist. The pain was a white-hot spike radiating up to her shoulder. Sarah realized then that there was no mercy in this room. There was only the experiment. The air in the apartment grew thick with the smell of Mark's expensive cologne, the one she had bought him for his birthday, and the metallic tang of her own fear. Sarah realized she couldn't win through strength. Mark was a former college linebacker. He could hold her there until the sun went down. She stopped struggling. He stopped. She let her body go limp, a tactic she'd read about in a self-defense manual. Mark's grip didn't loosen, but his center of gravity shifted as he adjusted to her dead weight. "That's better," Vance noted, stepping closer. He opened his briefcase, a sleek leather thing that smelled of old money and ozone. Inside, a silver flash drive sat nestled in foam. "We'll take the journal now." It served its purpose. As Vance reached for the diary, Sarah saw her opening. She didn't go for the book this time. She reached for the heavy brass lamp on the end table, her fingers fumbling against the cold metal. With a scream that tore at her throat, she swung it upward. The base of the lamp caught Mark squarely in the temple. The sound was a sickening thud, like a hammer hitting a melon. Mark's eyes rolled back, and his grip on her wrist vanished as he slumped to the floor, his head hitting the hardwood with a hollow crack. Vance froze, his hand hovering over his briefcase. Sarah didn't wait. She lunged forward, her hand diving into the open briefcase. Her fingers closed around the cold, angular shape of the flash drive. She didn't know what was on it, but if Vance wanted it kept in foam, it was the only leverage she had. "Sarah, don't be foolish," Vance warned, his voice losing its clinical calm for the first time. He took a step toward her, his face contorting into a mask of cold fury. She backed away, the flash drive biting into her palm. She grabbed her coat from the rack by the door, her movements frantic and jagged. She didn't look back at Mark, who was beginning to groan on the floor, a dark smear of blood blooming against the light wood. She threw open the door and sprinted into the hallway. The humid Virginia night hit her like a physical blow. The air felt heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and the looming threat of a summer storm. She ran down the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing against the suburban quiet. Every porch light felt like a searchlight. Every parked car felt like a blind. She needed a place to hide, a place where the experiment couldn't reach. Chloe Wilson had been her best friend since freshman year. They had shared everything: late-night study sessions, bad breakups, the stress of Vance's demanding classes. Chloe was the one person who wasn't part of this. She had to be. Sarah reached the campus dorms, her breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. She bypassed the main elevators, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her heart counting the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. She reached the 3rd floor and practically threw herself against Chloe's door. "Chloe, open up, please." The door opened almost instantly. Chloe stood there, her bright pink hair a shock of color against the dim hallway. She looked surprised, but not shocked. "Sarah? What are you doing here? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Vance. Mark. They're part of it, Chloe. My whole life. It's a study. I have a drive. I need to see what's on it." Sarah pushed past her into the room, her eyes darting around the familiar space. Then she stopped. On Chloe's bed sat 3 cardboard boxes. They were already taped shut, labeled in Chloe's neat, looping handwriting: Sarah, bedding; Sarah, books; Sarah, kitchen. Sarah felt the floor drop away again. She turned to look at her best friend. Chloe wasn't wearing her usual oversized sweatshirt. She was wearing a crisp, professional blazer. She held a tablet in her hand, the screen glowing with a familiar interface, a monitoring log. "We knew you'd come here first, Sarah," Chloe said. Her voice lacked its usual bubbly lilt. It was flat, collective. "We've been preparing your transition to the new facility all evening. It's better this way. The apartment was compromised the moment you became violent with Mark." "We?" Sarah whispered. "You too?" Chloe stepped toward her, her hand reaching out for a hug that felt like a threat. "We've been together since the beginning, Sarah. I was assigned to your floor for a reason. I've loved being your friend, really. It made the data so much richer. But the study is moving into a more controlled environment now. You don't need these things anymore." Sarah backed away, her spine hitting the cold glass of the window. She looked at the boxes. Her life, packed and labeled by a woman who had never been her friend. Every secret she'd told Chloe, every late-night confession, it was all just rich data. "You're a monster," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We prefer the term facilitator," Chloe replied, her eyes tracking Sarah's micro-expressions with a terrifying, predatory focus. "Now, give me the drive, Sarah. You aren't equipped to handle the variables it contains." Sarah looked at the drive in her hand, then at the pink-haired girl who had been her sister in every way that mattered. The betrayal was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in her chest. She realized then that Vance hadn't just monitored her life. He had built it. Every pillar of her support system was a hollow prop. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply turned and vaulted over the low dresser, throwing her weight against the window. The glass shattered with a deafening roar, and Sarah tumbled out into the night, the shards of her manufactured life falling with her into the dark. The fall was short. The second floor was only a dozen feet above the manicured mulch of the flower beds. But the impact sent a jolt of pain through Sarah's ankles that made her vision swim. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sting of gravel and glass. Behind her, she heard Chloe's voice, sharp and commanding, calling for security. She needed to disappear. But in a world where her bank account was a data point and her friends were employees, disappearing was a technical impossibility. She ran toward the edge of campus, her mind racing. She needed cash. She needed a way to get out of the city before Vance's reach closed around her like a fist. She found a secluded ATM behind a 24-hour pharmacy, the neon sign flickering with a rhythmic, buzzing light. Her hands shook as she slid her card into the slot. She typed in her PIN, the date of her mother's birthday, another lie, and waited. The machine whirred. A line of text appeared on the screen. Processing request. Sarah held her breath. She just needed $500, enough for a bus ticket to DC and a cheap room where she could think. The whirring stopped. A sharp, mechanical clack echoed in the quiet air. Transaction denied. Card retained. Contact your institution. Sarah stared at the screen. She pressed the cancel button, then the help button, her fingers drumming a frantic rhythm against the plastic. The machine remained silent, its glowing eye mocking her. Vance hadn't just followed her. He had anticipated her. He had flipped a switch, and her access to the world had vanished. She was penniless, she was alone, and she was being hunted. She backed away from the machine, her breath hitching. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the pharmacy window. She looked like a ghost. Her hair was matted with sweat, her coat was torn, and her eyes were wide with a primal, cornered terror. She began to walk, staying in the shadows of the large oak trees that lined the residential streets. Every passing car made her heart leap into her throat. She found herself at a deserted bus station on the edge of town, the air smelling of diesel and old cigarettes. A small television was bolted to the wall near the ticket counter, its volume turned low. Sarah stopped, her blood turning to ice. A photo of her was on the screen. It was her student ID photo, the one where she was smiling, her eyes bright with the hope of a girl who thought she knew her future. Police are asking for the public's help in locating Sarah Miller, a 21-year-old university student, the news anchor said, her voice professional and devoid of pity. Dr. Julian Vance, head of the Behavioral Science Department, says Miller suffered a severe psychotic break earlier this evening. She is considered a danger to herself and others. If you see her, do not approach. Call authorities immediately. Then, Vance appeared on the screen. He looked tired, his silver hair slightly mussed, the perfect image of a concerned mentor. "Sarah is a brilliant girl," Vance said to the camera, his voice thick with a manufactured grief. "But she's been struggling with reality for some time. This latest episode was violent. We just want to bring her home and get her the help she needs." Sarah, if you're watching, please, come back to us. Sarah felt a surge of nausea. He was framing her. He was using the very science she had studied to turn the entire world into her jailers. To the people watching, she wasn't a victim. She was a variable that had gone wrong. She was a psychotic girl who needed to be brought home. She looked around the bus station. A man in a stained trench coat was looking at the TV, then back at her. His eyes narrowed. Sarah didn't wait for him to make the connection. She bolted out the side exit, her boots pounding against the cracked pavement. She needed to see what was on that drive. It was the only weapon she had left. If she could prove what Vance was doing, if she could show the world the truth, the experiment would have to end. The university library was the only place with the power she needed. The high-security terminals in the basement were connected to a different line than the public ones. If she could get in, if she could bypass the lock, she might have a chance. The library was a brutalist monolith of concrete and glass, looming over the campus like a tomb. At 3 a.m., it should have been empty, but as Sarah approached, she saw the faint glow of security lights in the lobby. She found a side entrance, a delivery dock for the book return system. She squeezed through the heavy rubber flaps, the scent of old paper and dust filling her nose. The interior of the library was a labyrinth of shadows. The towering stacks of books created endless blind spots, the silence broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the automated sorter. She made her way toward the basement, her footsteps silent on the industrial carpet. She found the terminal room, a small, windowless bunker filled with a hum of cooling fans. She sat down at the central desk, her fingers trembling as she plugged the silver drive into the port. The screen flickered to life, a login prompt appearing in the center of the void. Biometric scan required. Sarah stared at the prompt. It wanted a fingerprint, a retina scan, something she didn't have. "Come on," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Think, Sarah, think." Suddenly the lights flickered. A low grinding sound echoed through the vents. Clack, clack, clack. The heavy steel security shutters over the doors began to hiss shut. The room was being sealed. No! Sarah lunged for the door, but the shutter hit the floor with a final, booming thud. The lights died completely. The only illumination came from the glowing red text on the monitor. Lockdown initiated. Authorized personnel only. A low buzzing hum began to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't an alarm. It was music. A low, droning funeral dirge, the notes vibrating in her very marrow. Sarah backed away from the desk, her heart racing. Someone was in the building with her. "I know you're here, Sarah," a voice echoed through the stacks. It was deep, gravelly, and entirely unfamiliar. "The doctor said you'd head for the data. You're very predictable." A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the rows of books. Sarah ducked behind a heavy oak table, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The humming grew louder. It was Robert Smith. She recognized the uniform as he stepped into the light. A campus guard, his neck thick, his eyes focused on his own belt. He didn't look at the shadows. He didn't need to. He had the sensors. "You don't want to do this, Robert," Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Vance is using you. He's using everyone." The humming stopped. Robert turned toward her voice, his flashlight beam pinning her against the shelves. "I don't care about the science, kid," Robert said, his voice as cold as the concrete walls. "I care about my pension, and the doctor says if you leave this building, I lose everything. I'm not losing my house for a data point." He lunged. Robert moved with a terrifying, unnatural precision. He wasn't just a guard, he was a hunter. He swung a heavy tactical baton, the metal whistling through the air. Sarah dived to the left, the baton shattering a wooden chair where her head had been a second before. She scrambled into the stacks, the smell of scorched dust filling the air as the baton struck a metal shelf. She was small, faster in the tight spaces. But Robert was relentless. He followed the sound of her breathing, the low drone of his funeral song never wavering. They reached the service elevator at the back of the basement. Sarah saw a heavy cart of books, medical texts, thick and weighted with knowledge. She grabbed the handle, her muscles screaming as she shoved it toward the approaching guard. Robert didn't flinch. He stepped into the path of the cart, intent on stopping her. But the floor was slick with the oil from the book return sorter. The cart hit a patch of grease and accelerated, the hundreds of pounds of paper turning into a battering ram. The cart slammed into Robert's leg with a sickening crunch. He let out a strangled cry, his knee buckling at an impossible angle. He collapsed, his flashlight spinning across the floor, painting the ceiling in wild, chaotic arcs. Sarah didn't stop to check on him. She grabbed his master keycard from his belt, her fingers slick with his sweat. She ran back to the terminal. She didn't have a fingerprint, but the MasterCard had an override. She swiped it, her breath hitching as the screen turned from red to green. Access granted. The files began to scroll. Thousands of them. Miller_S_primary_bond. Miller_S_risk_assessment. Miller_S_trauma_response. She clicked on the trauma file. The date was June 12, 2012. The day her parents died. She expected to see police reports. She expected to see photos of the rain-slicked highway. Instead, she saw a schematic. Project. Orphan_shift. Variable. Total loss. Method. Remote brake failure via signal interference. Sarah felt a coldness spread through her limbs that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She read the notes, her eyes stinging. Subject 001, Sarah Miller, requires a foundational trauma to establish a baseline for resilience, the note read, signed by Julian Vance. The parents are no longer providing useful data. Their removal will allow for a more controlled environmental shift. The accident will be staged at kilometer 42. High probability of success. Her parents hadn't died in an accident. They had been murdered for a baseline. They had been deleted like an old file to make room for a better experiment. Sarah sat in the dark, the glow of the screen the only light in her world. She felt a scream building in her throat, but it didn't come. Instead, a cold, hard clarity settled over her. The experiment wasn't just about her life. It was about her soul. And Vance was about to present his magnum opus to the world. The Founders Gala was being held in the faculty club, a sprawling mansion of mahogany and secrets. Sarah knew she couldn't just walk in. The police were looking for a psychotic girl. She found a catering van parked in the alley behind the library. The driver was inside a nearby coffee shop, his breath fogging the window. Sarah slipped into the back of the van, the smell of roast beef and expensive wine filling the cramped space. She found a spare uniform, a white shirt and black vest, and pulled it on over her torn clothes. She used a piece of broken glass to trim her matted hair, her reflection in the van's mirror looking back at her with a fierce, hollow intensity. She didn't look like Sarah Miller anymore. She looked like a ghost seeking a body. She walked through the front doors of the faculty club, a tray of champagne flutes in her hands. The room was a sea of black ties and silk dresses. The air was freezing, the industrial AC unit humming a low, aggressive tune. She saw him. Vance was standing at the center of the room, surrounded by men in expensive suits. The federal donors, the men who funded the cages. He was smiling, his silver hair gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. The Miller study represents a breakthrough in behavioral predictability, Vance was saying, his voice carrying over the polite clink of silverware. We've proven that with the right variables, we can engineer a human life from the ground up. Sarah moved through the crowd, her head down. She reached the central podium terminal, the one connected to the massive screens that lined the ballroom. She just needed to plug in the drive and hit broadcast. She reached for the port. I wouldn't do that, Sarah. Vance was standing right behind her. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The room seemed to contract around them, the guests suddenly feeling like cardboard cutouts. You're very persistent, Vance said, his eyes scanning her face with a clinical curiosity. I suppose I should have accounted for the revenge variable more thoroughly. You killed them, Sarah whispered, her fingers tightening on the flash drive. You killed my parents for a graph. I gave you a purpose, Sarah, Vance replied, stepping closer. Without me, you'd be an unremarkable girl in an unremarkable town. I made you a masterpiece. He lunged, his movement surprisingly quick. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into the bruised flesh where Mark had held her. They struggled in the shadows of the mahogany shelves. Vance was strong, fueled by a desperate need to protect his legacy. He threw her against a desk, the air leaving her lungs in a painful wheeze. You're going to be my greatest success, Sarah, he hissed, pinning her down. Even this rebellion, it's perfect. It shows the limits of the human spirit when pushed to the edge. Subverted. Sarah felt the cold bite of the desk against her spine. She looked up at Vance, seeing the madness behind the logic. She knew she couldn't beat him with her hands. But she had the back door. She had found it in the library, a hidden sequence of commands that would bypass the ballroom security and broadcast the drive's contents to every screen in the building. It was a failsafe, a way to ensure the data could never be truly hidden. She reached out, her fingers brushing the keyboard of the podium terminal. She typed the sequence. 7429 override. It's over, Julian, she gasped, her finger hovering over the enter key. The whole world is about to see what you are. She pressed the key. She waited for the screens to flash with the schematics of her parents' death. She waited for the gasps of the donors, for the look of horror on the faces of the guests. Instead, the screen turned a deep blood red. Access denied. Credentials revoked. Simulation complete. Sarah stared at the screen, the red light reflecting in her eyes. What? No, I have the back door. I found it. Vance let go of her wrist and stepped back. He wasn't angry anymore. He was smiling, that small, clinical smile that made her skin crawl. Oh, Sarah, he sighed, his voice dripping with a terrifying fatherly pride. Did you really think I'd leave a back door in my own system that I didn't know about? I leaked that access to you 3 months ago. I've been watching you discover it, watching you plan this little exposure. It was the final test. The test? Sarah's voice was a hollow whisper. The defiance quotient, Vance explained, adjusting his tie. We needed to know if a perfectly controlled subject would still attempt to rebel if they believed they had the tools. Your escape, your infiltration, even your little brawl with Robert. It was all part of the final chapter. And you performed beautifully. You walked right into the trap I built for you, thinking you were the one holding the key. He reached out and took the flash drive from the terminal. The server is currently wiping the drive, Sarah. And the back door you just used. It didn't broadcast your data. It just gave me the final authorization to lock you into the rehabilitation phase of the study. Sarah looked at the screens. They weren't showing her parents' death. They were showing a live feed of her, right now, looking broken and defeated. The donors aren't seeing a crime, Sarah, Vance said, gesturing to the room. They're seeing a demonstration of total behavioral control. They're seeing a girl who thought she was free, only to realize she's exactly where I want her to be. The weight of the realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't been fighting the system. She had been the system's favorite part. Her hope, her struggle, her smart moves. They were just more data. She had delivered herself back to him, gift-wrapped in her own defiance. Vance grabbed her arm, his grip firm and final. He began to lead her toward the stage at the front of the ballroom. "And now," he whispered in her ear, "it's time for your curtain call." He stepped into the blinding spotlights of the stage, pulling Sarah with him. The roar of the crowd was a wall of sound, 1,000 expectant voices drowning out her own thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance announced, his voice booming through the speakers, "I give you the future of behavioral science. Sarah Miller, a testament to the power of structured environment." Unfortunately, as you can see, Sarah has been struggling with a temporary mental collapse. But tonight, she has voluntarily agreed to join our institute for rehabilitation. She's coming home. The applause was deafening. Sarah stood in the center of the light, her eyes stinging from the camera flashes. She looked out at the audience. She saw James Taylor, the billionaire donor, tapping a sugar packet against his thumb, a look of bored satisfaction on his face. She saw the men in suits, seeing her not as a person, but as a successful investment. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Mark. He was standing behind her, his head bandaged, his face a mask of professional concern. He was the one who would take her to the facility. He was the one who would ensure she never rebelled again. Sarah looked at him. She saw the guilt in the corner of his eyes, the way his fingers trembled as he touched her. She leaned in, her breath hot against his ear. "Blueberry pancakes," she whispered. Mark stiffened. His breathing hitched. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sarah continued, her voice a low, rhythmic drone. "The stairs are uneven, Mark. If you miss a step, the accident happens to me. Just like the library. Just like the car." It was a behavioral trigger, a sequence of words they had used in a private game, a way to anchor him when he felt overwhelmed. But in the context of the experiment, it was a psychological kill word. It reminded him of the humanity he had traded for a paycheck. Mark's eyes went wide. He looked at Vance, then back at Sarah. The machine was breaking. "I can't," Mark whispered, his voice cracking through the speakers. "Mark, stay in position," Vance commanded, his voice sharp. But it was too late. The variable was out of control. Mark let out a primal scream and lunged at Vance, tackling him across the stage. The podium overturned, the silver tea service crashing to the floor with a deafening ring. In the chaos, Sarah didn't run for the door. She ran for the HVAC controls behind the stage. She knew the building's layout. She knew that the fire suppression system didn't use water. It used a chemical foam designed to smother electrical fires and dissolve magnetic storage. She smashed the glass on the emergency panel, the smell of ozone and old dust filling her lungs. She pulled the lever. A low, thundering roar echoed through the building. The vents began to hiss, a thick, white cloud of chemical spray erupting from the ceiling. "No!" Vance screamed, struggling on the floor with Mark. The servers, the data. The foam coated everything. It melted the screens, shorted out the cameras, and began to eat through the delicate circuits of the central mainframe. 20 years of research, thousands of subjects, millions of data points. All of it was being dissolved into a sticky, gray sludge. Sarah stood in the middle of the storm, the chemical snow falling on her shoulders. She saw a paper file lying on the floor, escaped from Vance's overturned briefcase. She picked it up. It was a birth certificate. Name, Sarah Vance Miller. Father, unknown. Mother, Catherine Vance. Sarah stared at the name. Catherine Vance, Julian's sister. She looked at the man on the floor. He wasn't just her zookeeper. He was her uncle. He had sacrificed his own sister, his own blood, to fund a research grant. He hadn't just monitored her life. He had stolen his own family to prove a point about predictability. Sarah walked over to him. Vance was huddled on the floor, his expensive suit ruined, his hands clawing at the melting servers. He looked small. He looked pathetic. "You're not a scientist, Julian," Sarah said, her voice calm and clear over the roar of the fire suppression system. "You're just a man who was afraid of the dark. So you tried to turn the whole world into a light bulb." "I made you," Vance sobbed, his eyes red and streaming from the chemicals. "You were perfect." "I am Sarah," she replied. "And I am the only thing in this room you can't measure." She turned and walked away. She didn't look at Mark, who was sitting on the edge of the stage, his head in his hands. She didn't look at the donors, who were fleeing the building in a panic. She walked out of the faculty club, out of the university gates, and into the cool, cleansing rain of the DC streets. She had no money. She had no ID. She had no history that wasn't a lie. She stopped in front of a darkened storefront, her reflection looking back at her from the glass. She was matted with foam and sweat. Her eyes were tired. But for the first time in 21 years, she didn't feel the need to apologize. She didn't feel the need to check her posture or mirror someone else's smile. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She opened the apologetic spreadsheet, the log of her 1,400 debts. She hit Select All. She hit Delete. The screen went blank. Sarah Miller smiled. The experiment was over. The future was unwritten. And for the first time in her life, she was the only one holding the pen. She walked into the night, a penniless ghost in a city of statues, finally, beautifully, unpredictable.